to the LDCEP podcast. This week we'll be covering the importance of voting. The Leadership Development and Civic Engagement Program, LDCEP, is a project of the New York State Independent Living Council, NYSILC. In this episode, we are joined by Brad Williams of NYSILC, Aaron Baier from Action Towards Independence, ATI Cortland, and NYSILC, Robert Meek, Esquire, from Finger Lakes Independent Center, FLIC, Disability Rights New York, DRNY, and NYSILC, as well as Meghan Parker from the New York Association on Independent Living, NYAIL.
So now let's introduce the topic of voting and its importance in our society and our culture. Our country is a representative democracy, and voting is the method by which we elect public officers into our various forms of government, including the national, state, and local levels. If you don't vote, you're not participating in the process that elects our representatives. Those representatives make decisions about budgets and issues that impact our lives. You can get involved by voting. Maybe you can be a poll worker, volunteer for a candidate of your choice, or even run for public office yourself and get elected. To begin, let's talk about the importance of voting. The original U.S. Constitution did not give everyone the right to vote. Many groups have fought hard for the right to vote, including people of color, women, young adults, and people with disabilities. Amendments were made to the U.S. Constitution, along with passage of key laws to reduce barriers and establish voting rights for all of these groups, especially people with disabilities.
The Constitution, U.S. Constitution, was amended several times to enable certain groups to vote that were not allowed to vote prior to the amendment. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, states that no citizen denied the right to vote based on color, race, or previous condition of servitude, that is, slavery. The next amendment that's relevant was the 19th Amendment, passed in 1920. No citizen denied the right to vote based on gender, which was women's suffrage movement. The next amendment was the 24th Amendment, passed in 1964, which eliminated poll taxes, which were used to deny mostly African Americans the right to vote. The 26th Amendment, passed in 1971, allowed all persons age of 18 or older to vote, allowing young people to vote. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was not obviously an amendment to the Constitution, but an act of Congress, outlawed racial discrimination voting. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 was another act that reformed the law regarding elections in the wake of the 2000 election and all the problems that occurred during that election. It included payments made to states and local governments to improve polling place access, to provide outreach and training to people with disabilities, and guarantee at least one accessible voting system per polling place for citizens with disabilities to cast private and independent votes.
The struggle to gain voting access. Over the past 15 to 20 years, New Yorkers with disabilities earned full access to their voting rights. It has taken a few election cycles to catch up and build a voting base as a community. Progress still needs to be made for us to reach our full potential. When you have additional time, you can learn more about the struggle to gain access to the polls in New York by viewing the documentary HAVA in New York, The Long Road to a Fundamental Right, on the NYSILC and LDCEP webpages. Let's learn more about people with disabilities as a voting group. What do we know about voters with disabilities? There are an estimated 35 million potential voters with disabilities in the United States and 1.6 million potential voters with disabilities in New York State. One study showed that people with disabilities are 20% less likely than those without disabilities to vote, and 10% less likely to be registered to vote. If people with disabilities voted at the same rate as those without disabilities, 3 million more votes would have been cast in the 2012 election.
So what else do we know about voters with disabilities? A 2013 study by the Research Alliance for Accessible Voting revealed that an estimated total of 15.6 million people with disabilities voted in 2012. This is compared to the number of African Americans who voted, 17.8 million, and the number of Hispanics who voted, 11.2 million. People with disabilities who are employed were just as likely to vote as people without disabilities. This suggests that employment helps bring more people with disabilities into mainstream political life. Almost 1/3 of voters with disabilities reported difficulty during the voting process. The most common problems reported were difficulty in reading or seeing the ballot, understanding how to vote, and using voting machines.
How did New Yorkers with disabilities vote in the 2016 presidential election? NYSILC conducted a post-election poll to assess the voting trends of New Yorkers with disabilities following the 2016 presidential race. The clear majority of New Yorkers with disabilities in this poll voted for Hillary Clinton, 66%. In terms of party affiliation, 76% were Democrats, demonstrating strong support from the party base among the disability community for the candidate. By geographic location, these individuals were not isolated to New York City, but were split by thirds according to large cities, suburbs, and rural locations. The reality is people with disabilities live everywhere. When asked to identify issues, these New Yorkers with disabilities prioritized first, health care and cost of medications, next, human and civil rights, next, affordable, accessible housing, next, addressing poverty, homelessness, and hunger, and finally, support for various groups and issues, for example, disability, LGBTQ, minorities, veterans, and women. The full report is available on the NYSILC website.
Why vote? Voting is a civic duty of every citizen. Voting gives you a chance to select people who represent you and your interests. Voting changes communities and sets a positive example to your family, neighbors, and friends. The government runs on your money, the taxes you pay, and gives you a voice to express how you believe it should be spent. Voting discrimination, barriers, and suppression still exist today, and every effort should be made to address and stop these practices. Every vote counts.
So now we can really see the importance of voting from a law and policy standpoint. Let's have a discussion about some of the basic voting issues experienced in our community. First, what have been some of our worst voting experiences?
So I am a voter who is blind, and a few years ago I tried to vote using the ballot marking device, or BMD, which is meant to be universally designed so anybody can use it. When I arrived at my polling site, the poll worker assigned to handle the BMD was clearly stressed out because she had never actually had to run the machine before. When I sat down to use the machine, it did not work, and she could not figure out how. I remember asking her, well, wasn't this tested in the morning to make sure it was working? And she kind of angrily said to me, yes, it was working then, and you should have voted then. As someone who works, I always vote after work in the evenings, and of course polls are open till 9, and the machine should be operational until then. To make a long story short, eventually we decided I wasn't going to wait for someone from the County Board of Elections to come and try to fix the machine because I wanted to go home and eat dinner. So I opted to have my husband simply fill out my ballot for me by hand. They then decided I also had to have a Republican and a Democrat there, so it ended up being 4 of us sitting around a table in the middle of the polling site publicly while someone read out the ballot to me, and I had to verbally tell them how I was voting in every race. It was just really a very stressful situation for me and left me feeling really angry, and took a really long time when voting should not be like that at all.
That is tragic. And that really reminds me of one of the first times I voted using the new ballot marking devices in New York, where I got there, the machine wasn't set up. It took them an hour to set it up, get me started. It took me 30 minutes to get through the ballot. And then as I'm trying to submit it, they broke the screen on the machine, and I had to submit my ballot by hand anyway. It was 2 hours of my life that I will never get back. But it was a good learning experience for the poll workers going forward. Most poll workers are volunteers, so I think it was a good experience for them in the long run. Does anybody have sort of a better voting experience, or what was their best voting experience? Because voting can be a joy as well.
So for me, when I recently moved, and I moved up to Albany County, when I went to go vote there, the poll workers were super friendly. They greeted me, walked me over, asked me if I wanted to use the BMD, walked me over to the machine, knew exactly how to use it. I sat down, the machine worked without any glitches. I was done in about 15 minutes. They helped me scan my vote in, and I was in and out probably in 20 minutes. Everyone was really nice, and I was just so happy that the voting process seemed to work exactly the way it was supposed to, and that was the first time that ever happened for me.
Awesome.
My worst voting experience and best are sort of combined because, and they're not personal. I was part of a team of lawyers that sued the city of Philadelphia about their voting process, both the accessibility of machines for people with visual impairments, and also physical access to polling places, trying to enforce the voting rights law. And before the lawsuit, we went around and had many people gave us their horrible experiences attempting to vote, both the inaccessibility of the machines and the physical inaccessibility of the polling locations. And when we were successful in getting a good settlement in the case, we did a follow-up surveys of various voting places during the election day, and we were very happy with the results. They were generally pretty good, that most of the places that we surveyed had actually done what they were supposed to do and had machines that worked and had created accessibility for people with physical disabilities. So they're sort of both in best and worst.
Great, thank you. Finally, let's talk a little bit about what we think the future might hold for the process of voting and for the elections process.
Yeah, I think we know that people with disabilities are the largest minority, and I think for the future, I definitely want to see us go from being disenfranchised to being enfranchised. I want us to really become like that voter bloc, so that the people in power pay attention to us. That every time that there's a discussion about an issue, we don't get omitted. We are at the table. We are in discussions. Our viewpoints are considered. It has been disheartening, but that's going to happen when we have that political clout through voting, and when it just becomes very apparent that we're part of a voting bloc that is large and votes often and is accounted for in voting polls. With that said, we also want people with disabilities to be poll workers. We want people to vote, to volunteer in campaigns, and to run for office and to get elected. So that's what we want to see in the future, and not such a distant future, let's say.
Thank you, Brad. I agree. I think the future looks bright, but we need to stay engaged as people with disabilities and as voters in general. If we're not involved in the process, then we're not taking responsibility for the people that get elected. I want to thank everybody for joining us on this podcast for the LDCEP. And I want to encourage our viewers to like and subscribe and respond to these questions in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts on good, bad, and the future of voting, especially for those of you who have disabilities. Thank you for joining us, and I'm Aaron Baier.